Hello everyone. Today we are looking at Indigenous women in North America and China. Now for this topic, one of the things you're going to notice is while there are a few female artist names that I have for China in this period, and we are looking at up through 19th century. So we've been looking at 19th century. I decided to do this one after because it is covering a couple different periods in time through or up to or through basically the 19th century. So I could have done this first, but I just decided since it went up to the 19th century, it could fit in this time frame after what we've talked about. But during this period, not really until the 20th century, do you start to have more names associated with women artists in these communities. So we don't have, for Native Americans, for example, we don't really have a lot, we don't have any names of specific artists. You start seeing, again, a lot of them actually having names attached to artists around the 20th century. And in China, we have a few, but there were more often than not women that, as artists, that did not have their names attached to that. In fact, in literature and other things, women were often referred to as wife of or mother of, and not with their actual name. So that's one of the things to keep in mind as we go through these two areas and looking at art. Also, of course, there still is pretty limited art by known that are by women that we know were produced by women. What there is a lot more of is actually art of women, portraying women by male artists. And I mean, this is common throughout the world, so it's not necessarily unusual that way, just that it's harder to determine what artwork is from women. And which artwork is from men. Well, not from men, we usually figure that one out. But whether some of the artwork that is anonymous might be from women. And so some of it is looking at general characteristics, aspects of society, the type of artwork in society. Of course, another aspect with Native American artwork is that even like the term artist wasn't something that was common in many of the tribal languages. And so you had artists that were making various types of art, but it wasn't this professional role that was defined in that way like we've seen in France and England and the United States. So just this kind of the background for that and why this one might seem a little bit different than some of the other lectures in terms of topics. We're still going to be looking at the artwork, but it's more in a generalized way. So for the topics, we're going to look at the background of Indigenous peoples in North America, basket weaving, jewelry and clothing, quilts and trade, women in the Qing dynasty in China. And so the Qing dynasty, this is where I was talking about time frame, covers a couple centuries. So you have the Qing dynasty is in the 18th century as well, which is why we're going to go kind of back in time a little bit and then move forward up through the 19th century. Artwork in the Qing dynasty. And so that's what we're looking at today. So we're going to start with looking at the background to give a little bit of context for Native American art. And of course, the other thing is that there were hundreds of different tribes, and each tribe had their own unique cultural practices, language, artistic traditions. So this is taking things that were most common that you saw in multiple tribes as what we're looking at, because of course we could have a whole thing that you individually look at different tribes, but we don't have the time to cover every single one. So instead I took the idea of, okay, what are the common types of artwork that we see in a lot of tribes? So this, just to keep in mind, what we're talking about here does not cover every single tribe. They were not homogeneous. They were very different. especially different in very different regions. So just keep that in mind too as we go through this. So starting off with migration, right? The people that migrated to North America initially were ended up being called the Clovis peoples, because of the arrowheads, actually. And of course, this was just the name. This is pre-writing hunting and gathering societies, so we can put that here: hunting and gathering societies. And with when it's a full hunting and gathering societies, that means they're nomadic, and that means that they're constantly moving around. And in this case, of course, migrating from Eurasia through the Bering Strait down into the Plains region around 11,000 BCE. And so historians and archaeologists have called them, or coined them, the Clovis people due to their unique arrowheads. We don't know what they called themselves. They didn't have writing. There wasn't anything that was left in terms of providing a name for us. And so this group, the arrowheads, were unique in that it's actually really interesting with the arrowheads because you can see the migration route by the arrowheads that were left behind and the remnants of that as they made their way. The Ice Age had begun to melt, and with that, it opened up a passageway through the Bering Strait, a land bridge where animals began to go through following the new grass regions. And so people began to follow the animal migration as well. This is an interesting period because you have the Ice Age is melting. You have a period of time where people are able to go through the land bridge before it's eventually covered in water. And you have the extinction of like around 32 or so larger Ice Age animals like the saber-toothed tiger, the mammoth, and a woolly bison, and so on. And so, of course, hunting traditions are going to shift and change too as the larger game go extinct, and you have more waterways. You have, because one of the things is with the, we'll say here, end of Ice Age, what it creates is more waterways, of course, because the ice melts. This creates more plants, and you have an abundance of smaller animals, right? All which makes it conducive for wild grains as well. And we'll say staying in one place longer, which is going to eventually lead to semi-nomadic structure, right? No, fully nomadic, you're constantly moving around following the animals. In semi-nomadic, you tend to stay in one place longer, and it only moves seasonally, and you move back and forth. So when nomadic societies don't tend to go back to locations very often, if at all, whereas semi-nomadic usually have a couple locations that they move to with the seasons for, of course, resources, and then go back to the place they were at, and they just go back and forth between those locations. Which of course is going to allow for the development of art. When you are nomadic, you don't have the ability to do large-scale artwork because it really is somewhat of a leisure activity, and you can only, when you're moving, you're bringing what you can carry with you. So you're not going to create large, paintings or pottery or other types of things that aren't also super useful. And that doesn't mean to say there's no art, because basket weaving is one of those things that worked with hunting and gathering societies, but it's going to be very minimal. Once you are semi-nomadic and then fully sedentary, where you stay put in one region, then you can start collecting more and more of these items. So it's not to say that there wasn't artwork, because we know basket weaving was actually ideal for the nomadic lifestyle because they were lightweight, they could collapse, they didn't break. But you weren't going to make 10 of them, right? Because you didn't have the space to take it with you. Now the Clovis arrowheads, as I was mentioning, I got off track there with that. We can actually track their migration by following the remnants of the arrowheads because they're so distinctive. In the early areas after migration out of Africa into Mesopotamia region and the surrounding areas, what you end up having is that those arrowheads were more, well, they were pretty rough initially if you go all the way back to the Paleolithic period, but then they end up being more just the kind of standard triangle shape. But you notice they're flat along the base. Right now, if you look at this shape compared to the Clovis arrowhead, it's a lot longer and super narrow. These were the kind of defining characteristics of Clovis arrowheads was the narrow and quite long arrowheads, but they still retained the flat or mostly flat. It has a slight, you can see it has a very slight curve, some of them less than others. So some, like this one looks almost non-existent with a curve, where you have these other ones over here that clearly have a little bit of a curve to it. But, and this is the arrowhead that is with people, with the Clovis people into the Plains region around 11,000 BC. And they are a single kind of group and community until after settling there, they begin to spread out across what becomes, in North America and becomes the United States. And the separation of geography and climate, allows for the development over time in different tribes with changes in languages, cultural practices, religious practices, and then, of course, what you wore, the clothing you wore, the food you ate, all developed based on the region that you settled in. And this then creates the multitude of tribes that are very different in structure. And when those migrations begin to take place and they spread out from the more singular Clovis people, the arrowheads change too. And so for the most part, minus the early Clovis arrowheads, North American arrowheads look different because they have they go back to the more kind of squattier triangle, but then they have this specific, and there's variations of this, right? So they don't all look exactly like this, but you now have this base that sticks out. And the idea for that was so that it was easier to, let's say if you're putting it into an arrow shaft or a knife base, you would cut a slit right down to a certain area on the shaft, and then this part here would go into that slit, and then you would tie animal sinew, which functioned like rope, around that to secure it. And it provided an easier method of attaching to for spears, for knives, for arrowheads, right? So you can actually know whether you have an arrowhead from the Middle East, Europe, Asia region, whether it's a Clovis arrowhead or whether it's a North American arrowhead, which for us, most of us have probably seen the North American arrowheads. So I would argue that even the creation of these tools is a form of art, both in the skill and technique that it takes to create these. And certainly while it's not, the main function is as a tool, and it has that purpose, skilled arrowhead makers were, created not only better constructed arrowheads, but they just, the striations from, you can see these striations right here. That's from what you do to make these is you have the rock that you're going to make the arrowhead with, and you have another rock, and you hit that rock against the edge of the arrowhead to shape it and to sharpen it. And that skill does produce a variation of how arrowheads look. Some are prettier than others. And then, of course, the type of stone that is used. And you can even see with the Clovis arrowheads, you have a large variety of colorful arrowheads that are quite pretty. And I think it fits into that early form of artwork in of itself based on the skill and the fact that those who were, really good arrowhead makers did produce really kind of beautiful looking arrowheads compared to someone who was not as skilled in that technique. So that's the first part of the migration and that type of thing. With that, and that's where I talk about here with the spread, right? That you get the different tribes and it gets the different characteristics and structures within that. A lot of the tribes, one distinguishing difference between, let's say, colonial America with the British coming over, or later Americans, and pretty much the rest of the world, is that not all, because again, remember, this is generalization, but a lot of the Native American tribes were matrilineal societies. And so we do have the definitions here. You have patriarchal and patrilineal, and then you have the one I didn't put because they're not, but you also have matriarchal and matrilineal, right? Okay, and it actually comes from, here I'll put patriarchal, patrilineal. So it comes from pater, which means father, and then mater is mother. But the idea from it, of course, is that patriarchal societies, patriarchal means men hold primary power and authority. It's essentially, specifically in a social system, okay? So it's patriarchal refers to a social system where men hold that primary power and authority in that society. Patrilineal, which of course, lineal is the line, is the father line, right? And that is where the male line is followed for all types of things, right? Your name, your children's name, the inheritance, right? It's important, especially for like the family tree line, for nobility in societies that had nobility. In order to be considered noble, you trace that through the father's line. Patrilineal also has, and matrilineal societies has another component to it. And again, most societies in the world are patriarchal, patrilineal societies. Even to this day, you could argue that we still are patriarchal, patrilineal. And certainly, while you could have said, I feel like we could have said recently that we were moving away from patrilineal, in part because of DNA and not having the same kind of emphasis on nobility and other things like that. We don't tend to follow only the father's line. We tend to actually look at both in family trees, the patrilineal and matrilineal side. Although most women still take their husband's last name when they get married, which is a patrilineal practice. But I was going to say that until recently, one of the things I mentioned is that we are moving, we are not there to equality. We were moving away from the stricter patriarchal patrilineal, although I'd argue we are now moving back to that, or it certainly is being pushed onto us back to that, trying to put it back to that system. So it is unique when a society is matriarchal, which would be, of course, that the social system is where women hold primary power within the structure and authority in society. That is very rare. It's not as common. Matrilineal is, of course, where you follow the mother's line for things. And that does happen within a patriarchal system. So you can have patriarchal society with a matrilineal system. And many Native American tribes had a matrilineal system. Why this is significant for women is that it ultimately allowed for a lot of freedom and rights for women that you do not have under a patrilineal society. One of the things with patrilineal societies is that then the emphasis on purity and virginity becomes super important because of ensuring the male line. But if it's matrilineal, you always know who the mother is. So you don't, there's the whole taboo on premarital sex and emphasis on virginity is not present in those societies because you know who the mother is. Usually matrilineal lines means that when you got married, you moved in with the wife's family. Women maintain more power and control within those societies. Also, in many of the Native American tribes, they were able to initiate divorce, which is a huge protection for women against abuse and other control. And what we ultimately see is that this, in combination with hunting and with farming, which is another component of that, farming and food production. In societies, those who control farming and food production tend to have a higher status in society because that is the value in society. And what's an interesting thing, and this is a side note with this, but you can determine the status of anyone in a society based on knowing what the value is. If you know what the value is in any society from any time period, then you know who has the status in that society. So for today, our value is money. Those who have more money have higher status in society, right? There's always anomalies, but that's the general course of it. In this period, it's food production. In hunting and gathering societies, it was just production in general for survival. Well, when it shifts to semi-nomadic and sedentary life, people get their food from farming. While semi-nomadic still will hunt and gather, they also start farming as well. When you are fully sedentary, you have to farm to support the larger populations, which means that's the value. And whoever is in control of that is going to have a higher authority. And many Native American societies, women maintained and held on to food production, which probably is what influenced the matrilineal structure within that society. And that ultimately provided them with a higher status. Older women had influence as members of the community. They were often seen as advisors. They were seen as important keepers of cultural and traditional practices, which we'll see is connected to artwork within clothing and jewelry as an expression of that cultural practice, and quilts as well. And also often were involved with trade, which is another way of bringing in resources that can provide that value. So we're coming from women played a super important role in a lot of the tribes, and this meant that then a lot of the work and things that they produced that we're going to be looking at today in art were also a component of that. I think this one actually could have moved on to the next one here. These were things I was talking about. So I covered this. I just forgot to move to the next slide. So sorry about that. Besides, though, food production, women still were also responsible for the domestic side as well. So that didn't go away. We've talked about that a lot so far with art and how that's portrayed in art, and how women have come up against that push for professional artists, because the domestic sphere is not usually connected with the professional role, and women were still responsible for that. So of course that meant any kind of aspect within the home, which is where you get the basket weavers, were predominantly women. Clothing and jewelry makers, and while men did participate in these activities as well, it was largely dominated by women. Also, of course, raising children and taking care of the home in that area as well. So a lot of the weaving quilts, making clothing for family and children. There was what's called an umbilical pouch, which was connected to motherhood, right? These things are all part of that domestic sphere. So with basket weaving, is probably the most prolific aspect of art. Is an example that we could talk about within Native American societies. And basket weaving started again with hunting and gathering societies because it was portable, it was lightweight, it didn't break. But we also are going to see how it transitions to pottery as they shift to semi-nomadic and sedentary, and actually carry over most of the patterns and styles of artwork on baskets was simply transferred over to pottery as well. the weaving of the baskets were both practical as well as for artwork. They were used for storage, transportation of goods, cooking, and women were so good at the weaving so tightly that most of these baskets actually could hold water without leaking. So liquids, some basket weaving was used to make musical instruments, ceremonial objects in religious rituals. All of these different type of things took place in that process. And there were, each tribe did have unique styles and patterns and designs. And besides designs, and I showed here with this one, you have the diamond pattern. With Navajo weavers often use the diamond pattern, although it wasn't unique just to them, as it represents the 4 cardinal directions. But besides one of the big types of patterns was, of course, geometric shapes. And in general, just repeating patterns, right? One of that, of course, is because that's easier to do than pictures, but that there were others who did incorporate and weave into it images as well. So it's not just patterns, it's just patterns, and geometric shapes are the most common. You had weavers that had a water bird pattern, which was meant to highlight the importance of water to the community. And then what you would do is that, of course, the pattern parts of it were dyed. The material was dyed, and then those were woven into the process. Now, there are a couple different techniques that were used in basket weaving. The most common was coiling, and this one is coiling here, right? Because it coils around. And so you have a base for the coiling, and then you weave the various materials and things from that around. You just keep going in the coil or circular pattern until you move up into whatever the shape is that you're creating. You have twinning, which is wrapping and twisting horizontal strands between vertical straps, and plaiting, which is weaving 2 elements over and under each other at a right angle. And so you have these are kind of the 4 main types, but the 3 that I mentioned here are the most common from this period in that process. All right, sorry, I bumped the mouse and the news thing popped up. So the twinning is this. So twinning was this one, plaiting was this one, and this one is wicker. Again, that came a little bit later and was not, the other 3 were the most common, although wicker does eventually get used as well. Wicker, though, is like the coiling is going to be the one that's the most watertight. Plaiting and twinning can be, but they're harder to do because it's not quite like the coiling one is just so tight and so close together that it can produce that kind of watertight component. And coiling is definitely the most common type of style in Native American basket weaving, although you do see the others used as well. The materials that are used for the baskets varied again between region. So it all kind of depends on that aspect of that. With various natural materials were used depending on the region. So you have pine needles, willow sticks, sweetgrass, horsehair. You have northeastern Indian baskets tended to have used pounded ash splint or braided sweetgrass. Cherokee baskets use river cane wicker or bundled pine needles. Southwest tribes use tightly coiled sumac or willow. Northwest coastal tribes cedar bark, swamp grass, spruce root. So a large variety of types of materials are used for the baskets, and often it was what was available at the time. And these were often then used to also add additional types of components to it that could include sewing in additional types of fibers. Of course, the dyeing of those, whatever type of fibers they were using to make the basket, you would dye some of them to create the different colors and create the patterns. But you also could have things like shells, quills, beads, feathers that would also be woven into the basket as well for more decoration and to add to just the plain basket with just the design. So the more elaborate, often ceremonial or gift baskets had those other components added into them. And baskets were used again for ceremonies. They were often centrally used. The activity of creating the basket as well as the use of the basket was central to women's lives. And so much so that actually there were some ceremonies where they were gifted to young girls coming of age. You also had them for generally gifts between friends and family members. They were often accompanied by sacred stories and legends, and so there would be patterns or images woven into these baskets that would be brought out to share when the stories would be told of certain stories and legends to reinforce and transmit those cultural ideas and beliefs. They also, of course, during births and deaths were brought out and gifted and used in that process. So these objects were not only created by women and in an artistic fashion, and it was a skill that young girls learned, but then also were used every day by women as well, and then also used by really everyone in society, because it was one of the most effective types of storage. And it was used for cooking, it was used for storage, it was used for transportation, it was used for holding things. It was so versatile in what it was essentially available and used for in that process. And then you have with the shift to sedentary life, you do have the transition to pottery, although basket weaving doesn't ever end. So one of the things that is, sometimes you have in transition of styles and techniques that one type of style of artwork, declines as the new one emerges. Basket weaving continues to this day as a tradition within tribes. So it just now happened with the use of pottery. Once you settle down and are sedentary and aren't moving around, pottery then is nice, because while there were definitely talented individuals that could make some of these baskets watertight, it was a process and not everyone could do it. But if you're making pottery, it is watertight, airtight if you have a sealed lid. It is potentially longer lasting and sturdier, although it is breakable if you drop it, which again was why they didn't, make pottery when they were moving around, because pottery is significantly heavier and it's breakable. But what's interesting is you can see in the style and design that a lot of the pottery simply transpose the various shapes, patterns, and artwork that they had been doing on the baskets onto the pottery itself. Now, in this case, you have the designs painted on, but they also could be carved into the wet clay. So I have like some pottery shards from the Four Corners. It was found near the Four Corners. It was actually found in a cave. That's not true. I have it in both places. The one that I have the most of is actually found in a cave in Prescott, Arizona. And it's about like 25 different pottery shards. And so just pieces of pottery, right? There's no full bowl or whatever, or jar. But you can actually see the design, and so some of them, the design and pattern was done into the wet clay, and then when it dries, that's embedded into the pottery. And then you have others where you have painted the two different colors onto, and you can see the original tone of the red clay with the pottery itself. This was very common in Southwest regions. And then you have a color, light or dark, painted on the whole of the pot, and then light or dark color used for the design. And usually brown, or not a full true black, but brown or dark color that looks, close to black was used. But you also had sometimes occasionally red paint as well. But the red is always a dye that's is a lot harder to produce, whereas as brown and other kind of neutral tones are easier to produce for paints. And so the tradition and stuff not only continued with the actual continuation of the baskets, but even in pottery, the same traditions that had been used in the basket weaving continued to be placed on pottery, just with new techniques. Again, whether that was carved directly into wet clay or painted on itself. And these, continue to this day to play an important role within society, and often, again, represent that cultural and spiritual significance, as well as, of course, individual artistic expression as well. Now, with clothing, jewelry and clothing, right, the creation of clothing obviously serves as a functional purpose of providing protection from the elements, but clothing was also, of course, created for ritual purposes as well. There were lots of things that clothing did. So clothing was, besides ritual significance, different types of decorations on clothing could represent social rank or family position. If you were successful in military and in wars, different designs, patterns would indicate that, as well as images that could be sewn into the clothing. Clothing had a variety of textures depending, again, on region. You had animal hides, as we can see here, or woven textiles, plant materials, and shells, beads, various types of beads, which beads, when we'll look at in a minute, bones, pine needles, shells, later, of course, clay beads and other types of trade beads that they got, all could be part of this. And the whole idea was not just a clothing that was for a functional purpose, but clothing to make have vibrant colors that made it stand out, meant to tell a story through the clothing, or again, rank and importance within society. Colorful beads, embroidery, weaving, patchwork, all were components of clothing. Largely that's something that women were the ones that were the main producers of, both not only for themselves, but for family members as well. I mentioned the umbilical cord pouch. That's this, here's an example of one here. So in some tribes, they would create umbilical cord pouches that were meant to hold the dried up umbilical cord of your child, and was meant to be a connection to not only your child, but childbirth, femininity. It had that special connection to life, birth, and of course the family members in that process as well. And not every tribe had umbilical cord pouches. There were certain ones that did, but it is another component that could be decorated into certain types of clothing, especially for certain ceremonies, and of course, once giving birth, having that be placed in to celebrate life. You had, again, different locations. The southwestern tribes produced woven textiles made of cotton and wool, while California tribes use plant materials and shells, and then the plains regions tended to use animal hides in their clothing. You have this is a Lakota vest that was a common one. The Lakota vest had all different types of meaning and were very unique to the individual wearer, both in patterns, again showcasing in good fighter, horseback rider, a variety of different styles symbolizing that connection. The Lakota were also connected to the umbilical cord pouches, symbolizing that link to the womb. There's a lot of different decorative techniques that were used here. You can see all of the intricate beading that's woven into the vest, the material of the vest itself. And all of this, again, was the design, the artistry, was both for just visual impact as well as, of course, specific designation depending on the circumstance of whether, again, it was for your place in society, your rank. Obviously, chiefs had certain aspects in clothing that could represent their status within society, but also sometimes just a way to showcase and highlight personality, interest, right? So that you could shape some of your, essentially you wore some of your personality and your interest and likes on your clothing. I mean, clothing still defines us today in many ways. We pick and choose clothing based on how we want to express and show ourselves. That was no different here. Just, of course, there's the connection that we buy our clothes now versus, of course, the act of the artistry in creating clothing, right? They could just have made a simple dress without any of the design. You could make a vest that's just straightforward, but the act of wanting the artwork on the clothing to provide that additional expression is, I think, that kind of key differentiating component compared to someone who's just making a plain shirt, right, without any type of design or characteristic to it. Another type that's a good example was the jingle dresses. So these actually were more modern, and it does go a little bit into the 20th century, but they originated in 1918 and is actually believed to be linked to the influenza pandemic. One of the origin stories states that a medicine man, his granddaughter was sick, and he ends up going into a trance, having a dream vision. And in this dream vision, it's of women wearing the jingle dresses and they taught him in this dream vision how to wear the dresses, the dances to do with it, and the music. And the spirits in his vision told him that that he had everyone start making these dresses and performing the dances, that it would make his granddaughter well. At first, she was too weak to dance on her own, and he actually made one of the first jingle dresses for his granddaughter, although women take over this tradition, and the jingle dress become a sign of really female strength and power and authority within the community. But she was initially too sick to dance on her own, and so members of the tribe helped her. When she gained enough strength, then she danced on her own, and the story goes that then she was cured through the dance. You can see it's a little hard to see this picture, but you can see the jingle dresses. What they have are rows and rows and rows of these essentially metal cones, and the metal cones can be made up of a variety of different types of metal, and they're all hung from the dress in all different styles. Each dress is unique to the individual woman who created it. And so when you move and dance, it jingles, right? It like clicks, the metal clicks together, and it creates almost kind of like this falling rain sound. And the dances came to represent kind of almost female empowerment of having an important role within the tribal community, of being able to express themselves not only in the artistic work of the dress, but in the dance as well. It was meant to connect to their culture, to show that they were proud of their culture and those traditions, so much so that this became, there was a point where the United States tried to outlaw these dancing ceremonies in the tribes. It was seen as somehow a potential threat because of the power that it had in bringing them together, to in creating a sense of cultural pride at a time when the United States was moving tribes to reservations and trying to eliminate Native American culture altogether by sending children to boarding schools where they disallowed any kind of tribal cultural identity. And so these dances were seen as a threat to that by the power of bringing that culture and that importance in the society together. And there was a period when these dancing ceremonies were actually made illegal, even with one going so far as a massacre within this event. But it played a very important role. It was centered around women. It was about the women, these dresses, the power that the music and the dance and even the act and creation of the dress and that expression of individualism, of community, of cultural significance in the designs, in the choices of that tradition. So it's a newer tradition compared to some, like we go back to all of the Clovis culture, right, of course, but still an important one that I think really showcases the power of art in clothing and the connection to community, to cultural and religious practices and traditions. Now, the other component with that, of course, is jewelry. And there's also different types of techniques and materials that are used in jewelry as well, which, of course, was incorporated into things such as necklaces and bracelets, and whatnot that way, but also were woven into other objects such as clothing, various types of accessories, masks, vests. Jewelry, especially bead work, various types of beading, was a central component in art as well. And something that was very time consuming and could be also, as we saw with like the clothing, very, very elaborate. So again, different regional areas had different types of materials that were used for beads, often what was in the region and available. In the Northwest and Midwest area, bones, shells, pine nuts, clay were often used. And so you actually, for some of these, like bird bones and other bones were naturally hollow, right? So those were small and perfect for making beads, but you also could drill in holes into other types of bone as well. So it wasn't restrictive just to hollow bird bones, but there's definitely is one type of easy natural bead because of the already pre-existing hollow nature of bird bones. But any type of bone, and certainly often connected to not only animals in the region, but ones that were hunted, or for example, the Sioux, the buffalo was a central component in kind of all aspects of their society. And so those type of bones would be more incorporated than others, depending on the region. But like for shells and pine nuts, for example, you had like the stone, the sandstone, and then you would take the tip of the shell, and there's different types of shells. A lot of shells will have openings on one side, right, but not the other. And so on the other side, you just rub it back and forth on the sandstone until it reveals the opening in the shell. And then you can put the sinew. Originally, animal sinew was used for the string to go through it. Same thing with pine nuts. You would go run it back and forth on the sandstone until it started to produce a hole. You would actually, with pine nuts, you had to like stick something thin up to kind of get the inner nut out. But once you had created the hole with the sandstone on both sides and then pushed the inner nut out, you then had a hollow area on the inside that you could run the sinew through as well. But also using clay and drying clay, and then with clay beads, those could be dyed and painted any kind of color or design. Bones could also be carved with design and style to it as well. Of course, again, it was for personal adornment, status, protection, luck, a variety of reasons. And again, not only in individual jewelry, but also then put into clothing and other objects as well. In the Plains region, teeth, claws, trade beads were used. In the 1900s, glass beads were introduced. And of course, within European trade, use of silver, nickel, and copper beads showed up sometimes as well. In the Southwest, the Navajos and Pueblo Indians learned silversmithing from Mexican artists, and so they ended up creating jewelry with really intricate jewelry with silver. So there's a large variety of techniques and styles and forms in jewelry that was used. And while we have some silversmithing and some metals, the main, just like with the clothing, the main type of materials for jewelry centered around the natural environment. I think if you're thinking one kind of theme or characteristic of Native American art is the connection to the natural environment and world around them. So you're more likely to see way more than anything else the bones, the shells, the teeth, claws, clay, pine nuts, things like that, because that was utilized far more than resources and goods that were not found in the region. And there's always kind of a tradition aspect of using what the land provided and the surrounding nature and region provided in that area. Besides jewelry, you also have quilts. Some style of quilts definitely took place with westward expansion from the United States and those cultural interactions in a couple of different ways. So with the quilts, you have, again, a mix of this cultural transmission that took place, both in trading and displacement. Quilts were something that was a necessity as well for warmth, but also was a way to express various cultural traditions and stories, a way to keep alive as Native Americans were displaced and put onto reservations, to keep alive the myths and traditions and stories as in that type of hardship. Contact with westward expansion brought new tools, though, that allowed them to incorporate different techniques into the quilts: beads, paints, dyes, silk, wool cloth, which not only new materials, but new opportunities for trade and for selling. Many Native American women sold the quilts that they made to settlers that were coming in and were in desperate need of supplies and didn't have the ability to make their own quilts initially. You also had different types of patterns, patchwork, that was a mix of adaptation between traditional Native American styles and practices mixed in with American European styles as well. And then, of course, you had in the Southwest the art of weaving cotton textiles on the loom. We know was around as early as like 700 CE. And Navajo weavers, it was at its height in the mid-19th century. Women worked with wool to prepare from sheep and dyed that for different colors, which the sheep were introduced by the Spanish, as well as commercial yarn from trade. So quilts is one of those things that not only is there a massively large variety and type of quilts, there isn't one standard for Native American quilts, but that you have this interesting mix of styles, of techniques, and patterns that were adapted and integrated into the various quilts. And this went both ways because many settlers actually ended up having and mixing in a reflection of Native American weaving into their quilts and patterns and styles as well. So they really have this trade and transition of culture between the two groups. And then, of course, you have adaptation from that of taking those techniques and styles and adapting it into their own culture, motifs and symbolism, usually reflecting those elements that were that from the traditional form of art with some of those new components. For example, you have like the buffalo with the Sioux was central to their life, both for food, for religious purposes, for clothing, for housing. It was a very common one. Here you can see the quilt with the buffalo in the center, and two examples of quilts too. We have a various type of star, point star that was used. You also had other types of nature imagery in quilts besides geometric shapes and patterns. Various colorful styles were very common as well. The use of color to have kind of bright something that pops, that draws you in was popular and very common. Geometric shapes, repeating patterns were very common. And then, of course, like I said, different types of designs, as well as the importance of putting in the myths and stories into the quilts that could keep those alive. Quilts were also given as gifts in special occasions, in religious ceremonies, and also as for diplomatic use. Many tribes, part of creating an alliance or diplomacy was the exchanging of gifts, which was meant to signify this idea of trade wasn't just an economical component, which was part of it, but the idea was that you traded with people that you wanted to create ties to. And so this idea of diplomacy and alliance was often interwoven with the economic structure of that, and women played a central role in the not only the economic component of trade, but the diplomatic and alliance component of trade as well. And it was through their artwork and through their creativity that alliances were formed and maintained, because proper trade was an important part of these kind of exchanges for continuing trade. So like and of course this evolved over time, but a really good early example, when the French were just starting to come over, and they didn't have like kind of the power component. So they had to learn not only the language, but cultural customs and practices. Again, for creating trade, you had to kind of create that alliance or diplomatic connection too. And so early meetings, the trade wasn't about the money that was made, but forming those initial bonds. And if you insulted your the guest, whoever that you were coming to trade, and didn't provide appropriate gifts, that could be the end of an economic trade relationship with that group. And so there's a story with the French coming over and bringing with ships with things that they wanted to trade, and they brought a gift. The chief and his men came to the boat to initiate this. And the French gave the chief a gift, and it was not up to par with what was expected. And so, seen as an insult or affront for not giving the proper, time and effort and value into the gifts, they were going to walk away. The French, realizing their blunder, said, no, 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 please don't go. We're sorry. We apologize. We offended you. And they say, come, search through our ships. Take what you think would be the appropriate, exchange of gifts to start this trade alliance. And so they went into the ship and kind of took more than that as making a point, and grabbed a lot of different things and left, and then said, okay, now we can trade, right? And so women were at the central, a central key figure within this. Their artistic creations were often what was used for trade in these alliances, and so they played a very important role within the community, and again reinforces that the kind of additional power and importance that many Native American women had in these tribes. From that, the star pattern often represents initially the 4 directions and stages of life, and then expanded through connection to settlers to create these larger than 4-point stars that emerged. Right, quilts were also, and I mentioned, used in storytelling, weaving images of creation stories and myths that were central to the community, and like I said, played an all-around important role within society. All right, we're going to shift to looking at women in China now. In largely the Qing dynasty, going just a little bit back to provide some background on filial piety and the role of women in Chinese society, but we're looking at largely the artwork from that period. So we just talked about with Native Americans that women had a lot of authority and power, and that was reflected within their artwork, and within the society, and that their creation and development of artwork also reinforced that power and authority that women had in these tribes. In China, that was not so much the case. Women in China were often defined by filial piety and not only patriarchal structure, but a strict hierarchy and social structure as well. The example we have Ben Zhao here. She was the first female historian of China. And this is in the Han Dynasty, so we're going back in time just a little bit with this. But her writing, I think, gives a really good example of how women were perceived and how women had to express themselves in that process as well. She's not only known for being the first female historian. Her father was a historian for the dynasty, for the emperor, and she took over after him. But she wrote lessons for women, and in it, I'm going to read a quote from her. It's like the very first introduction. And the lessons for women, she said she wrote for her daughters to share with them the proper roles of women and their duties and obligations and things like that. Of course, it was also somewhat for public consumption as well, but she framed it within the context of writing to her daughters to provide this necessary instruction. And so this is the very first sentence here in her writing, which again, she was a highly educated woman, uniquely so. A lot of women in China were not highly educated, but she was, and she, even being super highly educated compared to most women, even though being the first female historian, this is what she writes. I, the unworthy, write, I am unsophisticated, unenlightened, and by nature unintelligent. But I am fortunate both to have received not a little favor from my scholarly father. So, again, unworthy, unsophisticated, unenlightened, and by nature unintelligent. And then she diminishes her education by saying just a little favor from her scholarly father. So, and she felt it was necessary to preface her writing with somewhat belittling herself in order to be taken seriously, right? If she had come off more confident and secure, her writings wouldn't have been taken seriously, or she would have been called out for not having the proper role of women within the society. So again, why we went back far enough to mention her was just to showcase that this is kind of where women in China were coming from, is that they were within a society that had women be seen as inferior to men in many, many different ways. And by the Qing dynasty, largely restricted to the home, at least for the middle upper class women. As always in any society, lower class women had less restrictions sometimes. But it didn't mean their life was necessarily better. But of course, they had to be out in the fields working to help to produce food for survival. They had to, leave the home to help produce for the family. But middle and upper class women in the Qing dynasty were largely confined to the home. And so you have that difference. The other component is filial piety. Filial piety is like extreme loyalty to elders. This is that social hierarchy component that I was talking about. It was very strict with, of course, this patriarchal structure that men were higher than women within that. And the idea is that you owed deference to and extreme loyalty to your elders, to your mother, to your father, to your grandmother. This was very rigid in that sense. Like you didn't supersede it. Even a grown son who was married and had his own children was expected to maintain loyalty to his mother and his father. His mother and father were expected to maintain loyalty along with the children to any grandparents that were around. Now, where this benefited women is that women were higher than their sons and daughters, right? So if you were a grandmother, let's say that your husband had passed, but you were still alive, you were the most powerful family member in your family because of your elder role. And this filial piety it was weird because filial piety both gave women additional power and authority within the family social hierarchy, and at the same time put them within lower status. Women were to defer to their husband, to their father-in-law, their mother-in-law. And so women were pretty low on the totem pole until they were of an older age. Girls, of course, were the lowest within this rank. And this meant that within this expectation, of course, were that women were to stay within the home, focus on domestic work. In fact, the Lessons for Women talks a lot about the domestic role of women, and while at the same time very cleverly talking about why women should be educated and why marriages should be equal and loving. And I think part of her, with Ben Zhao's attempt within Lessons for Women was to sneak in these different advocacies for women having some additional, not power, but certainly education, respect, rights within the marriage, but she couldn't come out and outright say that. So when you then start off by talking about how the expected role of women is lowly and uneducated and not worthy, and here's the traditional domestic roles, and women are to get up before their husbands and make breakfast. In her letters, she says women are to be the first ones to wake up and the last ones to go to bed, right? Because their role is of service to everyone else. And yet at the same time she sneaks in, but women should also be educated. If they're going to serve their husbands well, they should be educated, right? if you want to have a healthy marriage, right, and the husband wants his wife to be deferent to him, and they need to be loving and caring towards their wife, right? And so advocating against spousal abuse, advocating for more equality within the marriage as partners is what she talks about. So it's a very clever way of pushing for some actual reform and change for women, while also putting it within the domestic terms that China kind of put women into these roles. Now, one of the other things within the Qing dynasty that was part of this, we'll see reinforced in the artwork. We're going to look at a lot of the artwork in this period is flowers, insects, scenes from basically what could you see outside the window of your home or in the garden of your home, was because of middle and upper class women largely did not leave their home, and certainly didn't travel or walk far because of the practice of foot binding. And foot binding was, again, lower class women could not have their feet bound as young girls because they needed to work. And foot binding all but prevents you from being able to be mobile. It was a practice that would start at a young age, between 5 to 7 years old, and involved bending the toes. When they started young, because of course kids' bones are more malleable back then. Even still, the toes, the bones, and the feet and toes get broken numerous times. You would soak them in warm water with salts and other things, and then they would bend the toes towards the sole of the foot. And you can see her tying up with a wrap the foot so that the toes were all being curled underneath. And this process would involve breaking and tightly binding the feet over a period of years until the toes permanently curled under the sole of the foot, which kept women's feet super small. And this was seen as a sign of beauty and wealth, while also causing lifelong pain and limited mobility. Again, it was reserved for the wealthy and upper middle class because once this was done to you, not only was it an extremely painful process throughout your life, but that pain, it didn't ever go away. So your ability to walk any kind of distance at all was almost non-existent. And again, even within the household, women often, if they were in the wealthier elite, they weren't doing the cooking and cleaning, because even that was a significant amount of work. So this did create limited opportunities for women in the Qing dynasty. And while there was an increase in education and literary pursuits, in fact, women's literature exploded during this period in time. Poetry was seen as an acceptable form of literature for women writers. And stuff. So while there was some increase in opportunities for women in the Qing dynasty, lower class women still spent most of their time working in the fields and helping their family for survival, and wealthy women, because of foot binding and the belief of the role of women as mothers and really a component of the home, it is somewhat what it was like. And with foot binding restricting them, they largely stayed within the home, which meant inside the home or within the surrounding gardens. Consequently, the artwork from this period was themes of nature, often gardens, insects, nature, and any kind of scene that could be seen from the home. Women rarely had expanded artwork outside of those areas because they didn't travel, they didn't see or experience those types of things. They didn't have access to even a lot of reference artwork. Though we'll talk about one female artist here who did, but it was rare. And so this is a very common traditional style of painting for women in the Qing dynasty. One of the very common types of paintings was called scroll paintings. And in scroll paintings, you have a combination of the painting itself and then calligraphy. And calligraphy was seen as an art form in of itself. And then not always with women, but you see the name stamp here. This was common in scroll paintings. Not as common with women artists, though, because not every, otherwise we would know their name for each of the artists. Calligraphy, to be a professional calligrapher, that was reserved only for men, because it took years and years of training to be considered a professional calligrapher, which obviously women were not afforded that opportunity. Nonetheless, women still did participate in the components of scroll painting, which meant that they often not only provided the painting of the whatever they painted, in this case a very, very common theme is flowers, but also the calligraphy component, where what you would do on the scroll painting is that you would have a poem, a short story, or statement, and then of course a title. So most would provide a title of their artwork, and then the calligraphy would provide some kind of context to the painting, what the artist was thinking or feeling when they painted this. It varied in that type of thing. It wasn't super long. You can see here, right? It's, a few lines. It was meant to be a short accompaniment to the scroll itself. And now scroll paintings, they were rolled up scrolls, right? And the idea was you could unfurl it to then slowly see the emergence of the artwork itself. Of course, when scroll paintings are displayed, they're then unfolded, but some artists incorporated the idea of you get like pieces revealed, right? So you start to unroll it and you see the colors and a piece of the artwork, right? Maybe just the foliage at first, and then as you keep unrolling, you get the vibrant color of the flower, and then as you finish unrolling, you get the full poem or short story or statement from that. And then, as mentioned with this here, let me erase that since I have lots of marks there. For sure, if it was a male painter, they had a stamp that had your name carved into a stone stamp, and you put it into this red paste, and it was always red, and it usually were squares, rectangles, or circles. But squares and rectangles were the most common, and then that was their signature. The name stamp was the signature, and actually is still used today in China and Japan for official documents. You can actually, in Japan, they have vending machines where you can go put your name, and it will carve and produce a name stamp for you. But of course, back then, the name stamps would be elaborately carved, often connected to family names and things like that. Some women had these, but it was not as common. Again, because often women in Qing dynasty were referred to as wife of or sister of over their actual given name, let alone signing your artwork. Again, some women did, but it just wasn't the most common component of that. So with all of these limitations, of course, again, the artwork then had its limitations as well. This is by an unknown artist, Women and Children in the Garden. And as you can see, you have two different areas here of depicting women and children gathering in a very elaborate garden. This is water down here with the lotus pond. And you can see the lotus. And so this is like a pavilion or deck on the water. This is definitely of a wealthy person's garden. We do know that we don't know the individual artist's name. This was a traditional type of artwork by women, because it would have been something that would have been viewed from the home and depicted roles of scenes that were acceptable roles for women. So in this area here, you have a group of women playing a board game, which was like a type of chess. And then You also have on this side here a woman being, it's hard to see, but she's being handed a musical instrument. She's getting ready to play a musical instrument. And then, of course, you have the trees, the lotus flowers that are being depicted from this. This again, it is considered a garden scene. But the wiki game, which is that chess-like game, and a musical instrument are two of the four perfections that were seen as acceptable forms, not only for the wealthy, but for women, which included playing a string instrument, or they were also sometimes called the four arts. So it was definitely connected to that artistic realm with that, which is playing an instrument, playing the board game, Chinese calligraphy, and then, of course, the other one, which is being displayed by the painting, Chinese painting, or just painting. Right? So these four perfections or four arts were seen to be an appropriate activities and aspects, not of the wealthy intellectuals, but for women specifically. So this one perfectly encapsulates that reinforcing the ideal activities of women in this period of time. Then we have, so one of the first female artists we're talking about that we actually know her name is Shenju, was one of the more prominent painters of the Qing dynasty. And she's often sometimes considered the first female painter of the dynasty. Not surprising here on all the women that we do know, they're wealthy families with artistic relatives, which again was also common in the other societies that we've looked at as well. Her son actually became a well-known statesman and poet, and it's actually from his biography that we know more about her, right? So we would probably not know as much information as we do about Shenju, except for that her son's biography talks a lot about her in his book. So, which is also a good example of that, you know, that she did a lot of different artwork, and yet it's still largely known through her son rather than of her own merit and accord. So she was born into a wealthy family. Her father was an artist. Her son's biography, he says that her skills were from, and this is a quote from his biography, her distinguished hereditary, fine upbringing, and a bit of divine intervention. And that her ability, he praises her ability to earn and add wealth to the family through selling her artwork, which again was also rare for, not completely rare, because there's one of our other examples is of a woman who actually had quite a bit of commercial success, but still rare, because the majority of women that were artists and painted in this period in Qing dynasty didn't sell their artwork. It was just for their home, for family and friends, and also probably explains why, if it's not disseminated to the public who's purchasing it and displaying it, it's less likely to survive over time. Sure, it stays within a family and either just never was known about because it doesn't go out to the public, or eventually, you know, is lost to time as the family member moves and changes in size. Those things are harder to keep long-term and preserve within the family unit. But she did sell her artwork. She also participated in charity and feeding the poor, which her son also said made her a good example of a good Confucian wife. So again, the terms and descriptions of how she's being portrayed are within these roles and expectations of women within China. She was actually able to, though, she tutored a few male family members who became well-known artists. And she also, unlike most women, focused on landscape paintings. Because she wasn't going out in nature and going on hikes and viewing these, she relied on male artists to get her inspiration. Some of which she probably was able to see, again, she was from a wealthy family, in books. and replicas of these paintings, and some only from, not from any visual reference, but just for descriptions of the artwork. So incredibly impressive in that sense that just from descriptions on some of these, she's able to use these male artists' landscape paintings as inspiration for her own. And she even, you know, her title is Landscape in the Style of Wome, right? The male artist. So she's saying, this is my landscape painting in this artist's style. And she often did that, or what did a play on words with the title that was to show its connection to a specific artist. But even though she references their work and is influenced by their style, like her different landscapes show the different styles of these male artists, she had her own components in the artwork as well that made it unique. One of those is, of course, the way that she did the more delicate lines and smooth lines of the rocks. Actually, and these delicate thin lines was actually a very common technique that women tended to use. You did not see this as often in male artists in China. But the way that, so you have this kind of influence, but then bringing in her own kind of formulaic strokes that created this smooth and orderly pattern on the boulders and the foliage in her landscape ones. Her second most common subject of painting were flowers and birds, which of course was the more traditional subject for women painters. She had many paintings of flowers, birds, vegetables, fruits. She had an iconic painting which was the white cockatoo, which I didn't put on there. I should have put that one on there too. It's actually a really cute little picture. It's like it's much more, it's unique because it's different from the rest of her work, which is a more kind of serious, delicate, you know, takes on the landscape and flowers and fruits and vegetables. And then you have the white cockatoo, which shows a cockatoo hanging upside down, swinging from a chain that looks like it's attached so he doesn't fly away, to a perch with flowers. And so it's this almost whimsical painting of this bird playing around and goofing off, compared to the more kind of straightforward and serious nature of her artwork in the landscapes and the floral and fruit imagery. Then we have Hui Bing, who is an artist. We don't know a lot about her. We know that she excelled at drawing flowers and birds. She was born into also a prestigious family and studied art during her childhood, which is also, you know, within the family. You have a very brief little poem at the top corner with her name stamp. Again, not typical for women with the scroll painting. And the flowers, you have another one where the flowers are growing out of like a bark or stone. Again, with you have pops of color within the flowers themselves, and then a lot of black ink with delicate lines and a soft design. So in the other artwork that she has with the flowers that are growing out of, like, it looks like a little stone. The stone and foliage at the bottom is it's really faint. It's super light. It almost looks like it's fading, and it probably is fading a little bit, but it, from the beginning, it had that imagery of fading with the stronger lines and colors, and the flower making the flower the central point, with the stone and foliage at the bottom of the stone being meant to be a less noticeable focal point as the backdrop. But so that you have this mix of kind of the more bold colors with the delicate light touch of almost fading black color. And you get, I mean, this one is all with the black work and ink. They actually had ink sticks. And you dissolve them in water, and the longer you leave it in and dissolve it, the darker, you know, the ink is going to get. Or you can have it be where it's light, because you use mostly water and it's more of a gray light hue. But what's interesting is that the women in a lot of it, the flowers or the insects or the birds have the bolder colors and more kind of thicker strokes. And then the surrounding background, if they even have a background, is the much more lightly faded black, to almost not detract from the central figure of the flower or the bird in that sense. The next woman is Ma Kwa, who lived in the 17th and 18th century. She specialized in bird and flower paintings as well, and she was able to sell her artwork. She actually had a significant commercial success. So she gained popularity, so much popularity that she had assistants, and the assistants would actually make her paint. And why that's significant is because, of course, making paint was time consuming. And so she could produce more and more artwork faster because she sold a lot. And so she was popular enough to pay assistants to make her paints so she could just keep painting and not have to spend time prepping. And then there would be more that would be produced that she could sell. One of the things that was unique with her paintings were that she tended to paint, we'll say, ordinary flowers, flowers that anyone could find. One of the common types of painting with female artists in the Qing Dynasty was paintings of flowers and birds that were in the imperial court. Women of the imperial court were obviously extremely wealthy. They had lots of free time, and so they would paint the exotic types of flowers and animals in the imperial court. And people enjoyed viewing this artwork because it showcased types of flowers or animals that the average person did not see. But with Ma Kwa, she was able to gain success from doing these, chrysanthemums and other types of basic that was in quotations as I said it, flowers. She added one of her poems talks about how she had no place to plant such flowers, but she could tend to them with her brush. So it's a very clever way of saying, well, I may not have a garden that I can plant these. I can tend to my garden of flowers through my brush, through my artistic abilities. So she's super unique in the sense that she was able to be so popular and sell so many scroll paintings because of that simplicity. There isn't a lot of her flower paintings didn't have backgrounds either. So the simplicity of her paintings, sometimes maybe the cheeky little poems that went with it, but again, did really well being able to be wealthy enough to have and make paintings so much that you could pay assistants. And then lastly, we have Yuan Zhou, who was born into an artistic family as well, with her aunt and grandfather. So not just a father this time, a grandfather and aunt. She was one of the more versatile artists. She did poetry. She's actually probably more known for her poetry, but embroidery and paintings. She wrote an unpublished book on medicine and was also interested and wrote on Confucianism and Buddhism. So all of that was more unique for women at the time. She married an aristocrat, and this is also, she's one of the few that she wasn't born into a wealthy family. She married into one, but she wasn't born into one that way. And she had 4 children, and she collected over 3,000 poems written by women in her lifetime. So you could say that she was also a collector of women artists, in trying and appreciating women's written work. She corrected more than the paintings and stuff. She kind of reinvented herself after her husband died. When she was around 50, she went to live with her son, and she changed her name she changed to a pen name, which was translated as essentially adept of the Lotus Lake, where she wrote several poems and created an anthology called Women's Poetry Anthology for a Correct Beginning under the pen name. The other thing that's crazy with this, so she also got to travel and see landscape and mountainous regions that many women did not. When her son had to move to a new prefecture for his job, she insisted that they go the long, more dangerous route through the mountains so that she could view them and then write about them in her poetry and paint them. And her son obliged and proceeded on the arduous task of carrying her in a chair that was meant to be kind of like a litter is what it's called. She could be carried through some of the more treacherous pass regions of the mountain. And in fact, had a painting of her commissioned. So she didn't paint a self-portrait, but this was commissioned and painted of her in this chair that was the litter that had took her through the mountain range that she wanted to see. This is one of her artworks, though. Of course, the paintings, we get flowers. You have the metal wire basket with, again, those delicate, more light lines. You can see how light it is here compared to the more vibrant colors of the flowers themselves. So even with how she was one of the more eccentric women in the period, and with all of the kind of defiance of kind of traditional expectations and collecting women's artistic productions to preserve and to highlight, she still ended up in her paintings kind of following those traditional rules and expectations of limiting to flowers, birds, insects, and other things like that. But a very unique character as well. All right, that's where we're going to end for this week. So I hope you have a good week.